Hi, I'm Candace Hunter, and I am a fiber artist. I got started like so many women and young people get started with sewing. I started sewing when I was, 6 years old, and I've been sewing ever since. It wasn't until I got into my early 20s that I found quilting as an art form, but also as a traditional quilting form. When I was really young, I referred to it as making mosaics with fabric, and nobody knew what I was talking about. It drove me nuts. But then in my 20s, I found quilting, and I began as an art quilt, as a traditional quilter. I learned the techniques and the whys for why traditional quilters do what they do. Every single stitch, every single rule they have has a really solid grounding in essentially engineering, in how to build a really good, solid, strong structure with fiber, which is really, really flexible, if you haven't noticed. So it makes it challenging to make a good structure, especially one that will lay flat and continue to lay flat or hang flat and not have a warp to it. So that was like my early beginnings. And then when I was in my mid-30s to mid-40s, I started looking much more seriously at quilting as an art form. And that was when I met the modern art quilters and the modern traditional quilters, modern contemporary quilters, I think is the correct term. But that's when I met them, and I began to work with the idea of taking the quilts that I was making and thinking of them more in terms of artwork. And my works got smaller because it's very hard to hang a king-size quilt on the wall. But even my later large quilts had more of a consideration of composition and color from that, the art sort of background. So I continued, and I found a variety of really wonderful groups and teachers along the way. For the most part, I'm a fairly self-taught artist in that I haven't gone to proper school, I haven't studied under anybody. The classes I've taken were mostly in specific techniques, like Patricia Cox was who I learned applique technique from ages upon ages ago. And I've, taken one-off classes here and there. So, but most of the work I've done in the more recent years, I'm now in my mid-50s. And I've spent the last decade dreaming of having a show, my first art show, and I knew a decade ago that I needed to build what art is called a body of work. And a body of work sounds huge and scary and big, and so I figured, well, if I just try to build stuff, like just make more works, and don't worry about whether they go together or look good together at first, let's just try to make stuff. And I started doing that, and works begat more works, and many artists will tell you, once you get started, if you just don't stop, you just keep going, you'll end up with a body of work soon enough. And from that body of work, you'll be able to select stuff that will actually go together. So that was my goal over the last decade, and I have reached my first show, and I'm super excited about that. This piece here that I wanted to share with you guys is one of my transitional pieces. It's called Rooted in Tradition, and it was originally built or created for a exhibit that was done by the Studio Art Quilt Associates of Oregon. My particular group is called Valley South, so I'm gonna plug in for them because they're awesome. But the ladies there have given me so much inspiration as amazing artists. And one of the pieces, this particular piece was done for a showcase that we all as a group did in Oregon. When I was building this one, I was thinking a lot about my own roots, which are very much in traditional quilting. And you can see some of the traditional quilting patchwork that I've got here. This particular blue and patchwork pieces, I think it's called 9 patch. I can't remember the name of the pattern, but whatever that is, was originally part of a baby quilt that I made for some friends, and that was a couple of the squares that were left over. So my leftover stuff goes into what I call the bin, where it will eventually be used again in some other way. So that's a very traditional quilter approach to how to create pieces, artwork, or whatever you're creating. This particular piece was one where the orange and the turquoise were my two of my very first dyeing experiences. So I was beginning to experiment with breaking the rules, not going out and buying fabrics as much as creating my fabric. That's part of one of the pieces I love about this. I also love this particular composition because it's one of my early breaking away from formal structure and from really thinking I needed to do a very representational piece. I was starting to move a little bit into some somewhat abstract concepts, which is a very artist's way of looking at it, not very much a traditional quilter way of looking at it. So I was in a very big transitional place, and part of the importance in this piece to me was remembering that my roots are in traditional quilting and always respect that, because that has given me the capacity to build work, no matter what I'm doing, that always hangs well. And I'm really proud of that. And I'm really grateful to the generations upon generations of people, but I'm also going to say women, because traditional quilting has long been a woman's craft. So I'm grateful to all of them for giving me the knowledge. This piece here that I wanted to share with you is called Sisters. I built this one just this last summer, and this summer I started moving much more into a process I'm calling dye later. So similar to an artist and fine arts practice, I build a palette and I draw a picture with the quilting on it, and then I apply the color. In my case, I'm using dye, and I tend to use my dyes a lot like painters use their paints. I mix as I go. I start with just 3 basic, yellow, red, and blue, and then all the colors here are mixed from that. One of the things I love about this process is it allows me to open myself up to the muse a lot more than I think even painters get to, because when you're painting, you put your paint down, you put down your red, and that's the color you've got. But when you're dyeing, the color you've got changes because you have to wash out the excess dye. And sometimes it sticks and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes things get a little bit hazardous. Like, for instance, up here in the greens, you can see the green that moved into the yellow area. That was thanks to my muse, because that green was not in that yellow before the washout. But it moved. And one of the things that I found about this process that's so neat is that you'll notice that the bits that moved, they're not washed out and watery, they're actually kind of deliberate. And so I find that frequently when I'm working with that and saying, okay, muse, you can be a part of this, have an influence, they do, or my muse does, and the results are not always what one would expect. They're not washed out, or they're not watercolor-like. Sometimes they are, but often they're not. They're often distinctive. So this is one of the pieces that is moving much more in the direction of a fine arts types of tools. One of the things I love about fiber art myself is that we use fiber arts tools like, stitching, and we use quilting, the layering and all of that, which is very much traditional quilting. But we also use fine arts stuff like the painting that I did in here to emphasize the white ripples or the waves in the current. Or we use, I use the dyeing practice, to essentially paint my quilt. So it's kind of like I get to use a little bit from fine arts, and I get to use things like the, what was this called? The satin, I think they call it rat tail, but that's satin cording. So I'm using satin cording and adding that on, and in fine arts, this would probably be called mixed media, because I'm starting to work from many things, and other art quilters do things like include paper on their quilts, and I certainly could. I didn't in this one. So it's like that, but because it's fiber arts and because it's art quilting, we don't have to say mixed media, because fiber arts encompasses all of that. And I find that really fun. I am actually an herbalist by trade. I've been teaching and working with the plants for ages and ages. And so the plants have a really, really strong influence on what I do. One of the ones I wanted to talk about here is called Mushroom Eyes. And if you've ever gone mushrooming in the woods, you know you may know the term mushroom eyes. It's when we put on like the goggles that allow us to see the mushrooms, because they hide. They hide under the bits of moss and the lichen and the ferns and wherever else it is. You know, they're hiding. But if you put your mushroom eyes on, you can see them. And they come out like these here. You can see the chanterelles, the amanitas. They just sort of appear. And what happens, and this is one of the pieces that is a nature-related piece for me, that I asked the mushrooms to give me some help, because while I was building it, I had this beautiful escape down here, and then these trees just went up and it was very boring. And the mushrooms said to me, well, you know, you don't notice the trees, do you? Cut here, cut here. I mean, I literally heard that and saw exactly where to cut, so I did it and thought, oh dear God, what have I done? Then I reconstructed with the jagas, because the truth is that when you're in the woods and you're looking for mushrooms, you're not seeing the trees, and they are just this sort of weird, disparate objects in the sky. And in fact, if you're looking for reishi, you have to remember to look up, because it's so easy to get your mushroom eyes on and just be watching the ground. So that was how Mushroom Eyes was born, and that's kind of I guess you could say, an explanation of how nature manages to creep into just about everything I do. Nature has a huge influence on what I do, and I feel like I am often standing right in the threshold between human world and not human world. And one of the things that I've been entertaining for a while now is the fact that we as humans are animals, and we are very much a part of nature, no matter how much we try to pretend that we aren't. We are. So this piece here, called Break On Through, is about breaking through our thought process of how we are only cars and houses and somehow different than nature, and recognizing that we are a part of nature, and that it's really just shifting your mindset. What I have found in my own practice is the trees often help us to ground, help us to get clear about things. When you're feeling really down, you go and hug a tree. Or just sit near one and sit under one if you're afraid to like hug a tree, because that does look crazy. People have laughed at me when I do it. It's true. So the reason I use the tree here is in part because of that aspect of trees, and they always remind me when I'm feeling overwhelmed, especially very upset about something that's very human in nature. You know, a recent news story that was very upsetting. I go and I sit with the trees, and they're like, hey, you know, breathe. It's all right here. Everything's right here. We're fine. You're fine. So it's partly that, but it's also partly the idea of the fairylands and the old traditional idea that you can walk through gateways. And oftentimes trees like Yggdrasil provide a gateway for us from one dimension to another. So this piece is partly about how you can break through into other dimensions just by asking. So for the month of December in 2023, I have been honored to be the featured artist at New Zone Gallery. I've been a part of this gallery for about a year now, just over, and I've got to say a shout out to Will Mitchell. He's amazing, and he's the reason why I'm here. He said to me one day, you know, you really should show your stuff in the Zone for All show. And I thought, okay, I'll do that. Had a few panic attacks about it, but I did it. He encouraged me, and he kept kind of, so have you got your application in? Asking, and I said, okay. And I did it, and it was a terrific experience. I mean, the people at New Zone are so amazing. And then I was absolutely floored. About a week after the show was done and taken down, I got a call from Diane Cunningham, who was the president at that time. Well, she still is today, but she was the president, and she said, we'd like you to come in and interview for position at the gallery if you're interested. And again, more panic attacks, but I said yes, and I showed up and I did my thing, and there were like 9 other people. There were so many people there that were, you know, they said, oh, we've never had this many people want to join all at once. I can't even imagine that, to be honest. But so I did that, and I first got a rejection, but then I got an acceptance like the day later. And I was like, yes, I'll be in. And she said, yes, come on in. It was Black Friday. And I came in on Black Friday and signed up and said, oh, thank you. And it has been an incredible experience ever since. I cannot say enough good about the artists who are a part of this particular gallery. I don't have other gallery experience. This is my first show ever. And so I can't tell you what it's like elsewhere, but I can tell you that here is an incredible community of people that are supportive of one another. We've got a wide range of art types in the gallery, and everybody's really just supportive, helpful, encouraging. So I'm grateful to be here and a part of the gallery, and I do hope that you'll come down and see my work here.